Tal, great to connect today. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Nate.
You've done a lot of work on happiness and you spend a lot of time thinking about, writing about, teaching about topics related to happiness. And as you think back on the things you've learned, I'm wondering if there's an experience you had where you learned something that you would most want to pass on to others.
Yeah. I think probably the most important lesson that I would want to pass on to others, whether it's my kids or my clients, is the notion that the first step to happiness is allowing in unhappiness,
Hmm.
meaning that the foundation, the pillar of, uh, of the good life is giving ourselves the permission to be human. So I first thought of this idea the first year when I was teaching a class on positive psychology at Harvard. I was having lunch one day when a student came over, and he wasn't in my class, but I knew him. And he said, "Tell me, I join you for lunch." And I said, "Sure." So he comes over, sits down, we begin to chat. And then he says, "Tal, I hear you're teaching a class on happiness." This was 2004, my first year teaching positive psychology. And I said to him, "Yeah, I'm teaching a class on positive psychology." And he said, "My roommates are taking your class." And I said, "That's great." And then he said, "But now, Tal, that you're teaching this class, you've got to be careful." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Tal, you've got to watch out." And I said, "How come?" And he said, "Because if I see you unhappy, I'll tell my roommates." And I actually used that in class the following day when I spoke to my students. And I said to them, the last thing in the world that I want you to think is that I'm always happy, or that you, by the end of the semester, will experience, a constant high. Because there are only two kinds of people who do not experience painful emotions, such as sadness or anger or frustration, or anxiety. Two kinds of people. The first kind of people who don't experience painful emotions are the psychopaths. The second kind of people are dead. So if you experience painful emotions, it's actually a good sign. It means you're not a psychopath and you're alive. The problem, though, in today's culture, and again, this is why I think this message is so important, is that most people, most of the time, do not give themselves the permission to be human. So they suppress rather than express painful emotions. They think there is something wrong with them if they experience envy towards a friend or anxiety before giving a presentation, when in fact there is everything right with us when we experience these painful emotions. And the paradox is, and we know this from research by Daniel Wagner on ironic processing and research by Viktor Frankl on paradoxical intentions, we know that when we reject painful emotions, these emotions only intensify, they grow stronger. So if I tell myself, Tal, you shouldn't be sad, you're the happiness professor, immediately my sadness skyrockets. Or if I say to myself, you shouldn't be envious of your friend, you ought to be better than that. Immediately that envy, a natural human emotion, grows stronger. So, in the words of Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist, what you resist persists. And if we are to experience these emotions and get over them, we need to give ourselves the permission to be human. We need to let them flow through us, to leave just as they came. So, this idea of the permission to be human, of allowing in unhappiness, is so important for the experience of happiness, for fulfilling our potential for well being.
Well, that was unexpected. I did not expect you to go that direction. And as you describe it, it makes perfect sense in that if I'm putting pressure on myself to be happy and I'm not, that will immediately make me less happy. So I can clearly see how this pressure we put on ourselves can cause the problems that we're trying to avoid. So a few different questions. Curious about your thoughts on Stoicism. In what ways does Stoicism get things right, and in what ways might you maybe recommend a different approach, or can your approach be reconciled with Stoicism?
Yes, so my response to that would be a yes and response, meaning there is so much wisdom in Stoicism. Essentially, cognitive therapy is based on
Yeah.
the Stoic premises, and we know that it works. We know that it works because it makes sense, and we know that it works because there's a lot of research around that. The and part would be that I would put more focus, more emphasis on the acceptance. This is why I'm a very big proponent of ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, as the approach to psychotherapy, because it doesn't do away with the cognitive part and or with the mindfulness part, or certainly not with the behavioral part. This is why it's called ACT. However, at the same time, it's also very much about accepting, embracing, giving space for the experience of any and all emotions. Basically, what it says is that all emotions are acceptable, that emotions are actually outside of the moral domain, meaning there is no good or bad emotion. Emotion is like the law of gravity, it's simply a fact of nature. And just like you can't build a flying machine without accepting the law of gravity, you can't flourish or fly without fully accepting the whole range of human emotions. So yes, stoicism in terms of our ability to hold still, to continue through life unfazed, alongside a very strong focus on acceptance, accepting the full range of human emotions.
Interesting. So a stoicism that says don't feel anything, it would be not consistent with what you're talking about, but a stoicism that says, look, we've got to persist and accept. I mean, I guess that's one angle on stoicism is like accept whatever you
Exactly.
are and confront it. So yeah, I guess I can see in many ways how it can be perfectly consistent depending on how we're thinking about it or defining it.
Nate, it's an interesting point you bring up, because what we see with many of the Greek philosophers is that they're misinterpreted today. So, for example, when people talk about Epicurus, they say, "Oh, Epicureanism, that's hedonism. That's seek pleasure, avoid pain." Well, you read Epicurus, is much more than that. He's not just about go have ice cream and lie on the beach, sex, drugs, rock and roll. Not at all. He's about a very rational and deep approach to a happy life. However, in the modern day, Epicureanism essentially means hedonism. Similarly with Stoicism, people say, oh, you're Stoic, meaning you don't show any emotions, you don't experience any emotions, you're above emotions. That's not really what, Seneca or Marcus Aurelius meant. They felt very strongly. However, they didn't take emotions as the end all. Emotions are there. Again, law of gravity, it's there. The question is, what do we do with them once we experience them? So I think Seneca and Marcus Aurelius their ideas would coincide with however, our interpretation today is different.
Yeah, the nuance matters. Okay, so how do we accept without falling into rumination?
Yeah, very, very important distinction there, because acceptance doesn't mean resignation. It doesn't mean, okay, so, I'm feeling down now, so I'm just going to sit in front of the TV and veg out for the next 3 months and basically ruminate about how terrible my life is. Not at all. It's not about resignation, it's about active acceptance, meaning accepting whatever emotion I experience and then choosing the most appropriate course of action. So I can experience envy towards a friend. No big deal. The question is, what do I do with that envy? Do I hurt my friend, or do I continue to be kind and generous towards my friend? Or similarly with fear. Experiencing fear, again, natural human emotion. The question is not whether or not I'll experience it. I will at times. The question is, what do I do with it? And I can experience fear and then choose to act courageously, because courage is not about not having fear. It's about having fear and then going ahead anyway.
Yeah, that's a good point. There is no such thing as courage. If there's nothing to be afraid of, it doesn't take courage to behave. Like there can't be courage without fear. That
It's a
makes a lot of sense.
prerequisite.
Yes.
Exactly.
I was interviewing Avi Kluger on the podcast, and Avi is so wonderful, and he was talking about his goal of becoming a better listener every day. And what he realized pretty soon was that every day he would fail and he would make mistakes, and it started demotivating him. And so what he did was every time he caught himself not listening as well as he had hoped or as well as he was trying, he would pat himself on the back. He would acknowledge that he'd messed up, and then he would keep trying to do better. And it just reminded me of this ACT therapy, acceptance and commitment. Accept that you messed up. But I mean, the acronym here is just so perfect. So obviously this is, not done by chance. After we
Yeah.
accept, then we get to choose where we go from there.
Yeah, Stephen Hayes and Russ Harris and others who have created and talk about ACT insist that we do not call it ACT. With CBT, we say KBT, right? We say
Yeah,
CBT.
yeah.
With ACT, they insist that we call it ACT in order to emphasize the importance of taking action and not taking random action, acting in accordance with your values.
Has there been a time in your life when this lesson became especially helpful to you?
Yeah. I mean, I'm gonna provide a bit of a cliche answer here, but it's almost every moment of my life, or at least every day. I'll give you a recent example. So I just came back from a trip to Latin America, and I had a very large and important lecture coming up, and I was exhausted. It was on the back of you know 15 or more days of touring, speaking a lot. I was absolutely exhausted. And I didn't feel like getting on stage. Now, I could have said to myself, come on, Tal, you must be excited. This is an important lecture. But instead, what I did was I said, okay, so I'm feeling tired, big deal. I'm going to do what I care about so much, which is share ideas that I care about so much. And, I went on stage, and of course, within 2 minutes, I was there, but not because I quote unquote forced myself not to feel down, but it's because I accepted feeling down and then went ahead and did or acted according to my values.
Yeah, great example. And I love, as I think about it, how cool it is that it's relevant all the time. It's a simple experience, but you could go on, you could give countless other examples of how this is something that we can constantly be applying every day of our life, not just to use it, a couple times and have it change the trajectory. This is something to use every single day. Any final things you'd like to share just as we wrap up here?
Yeah, I want to talk about the fact that we can use it every day. I wear a bracelet, and I wear a bracelet not just for its aesthetic value, which I think it has some,
Mhm.
but for its reminder value. So, this is a bracelet that reminds me to accept, to embrace, rather than to reject and deny. And the importance of reminders in our life is critical for mental health. Why? Because of the knowing doing gap. Socrates, the father of Western philosophy, once remarked that to know the good is to do the good. To know the good is to do the good. Now, Socrates was a very smart man, of course, but in this case, he was wrong. Not a
Mystic,
little
yeah,
wrong, but
yeah.
very wrong. Just knowing the good in and of itself is not enough. So just knowing that it's good for me to give myself the permission to be human, doesn't mean that I'll do it every time. Just knowing that it's important for me to appreciate my life or my loved ones, that it's important doesn't mean I'll do it. Or just knowing that being kind is a lot better than being unkind doesn't mean that I'll be kind all the time. And we fall short of what we know, not because we're not good people, not because we're not smart, but simply because we forget. So having reminders, and reminders can come in the form of a bracelet or, on our calendar on the phone, or pictures on the wall that remind us of important elements in our life, or a quote that we have on our wall, or something that we read and reread day in and day out. Reminders are critical for us to draw closer to our ideal version of ourselves.
I love the emphasis on reminders. I know it's good to exercise, and it's so easy to not. And about 6 months ago, I said, I'm going to put it on my calendar every single day. And it's helped. And it's helped surprisingly well. So I love this idea of reminders, using things that will help remind us to act, to experience the emotions, and then choose how we're going to react. Well, Tal, this was so great for me. I love that you've given me a tool that I can use every day, that listeners can use every day. And like I said, it was unexpected. I did not think that was what you were going to say on how to live a happy life, but I really appreciate you sharing such a wonderful lesson. So thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Great. Thank you, Nate.